Well, church, once again, welcome. And I'm going to start off by asking you guys something really quick. Have you guys ever noticed how quickly we look for someone to blame when things happen? Have you guys ever felt like you are going through a trial or you're just facing something and then all of a sudden you try to shift your blame onto somebody else? Or maybe you try to shift the blame onto the circumstances that you find yourself in? When things go wrong, we start looking for explanations. All of a sudden, something just happens out of nowhere, and then you're like, well, now I have to find out exactly what it is and where it happened and why did this happen. We start blaming stress because we start feeling a little bit sick, or maybe just all of a sudden we get irritated and we say, no, I'm just stressed out. Maybe you start blaming the environment. Man, it's because of the job that I have, or it's because of where I'm living, or it's because of this other situation. Maybe we blame our upbringing. Well, I was raised this way, and this is what I was taught, and this is how I deal with myself, and this is how I deal with all these other things. Or maybe it's not even any of that. Maybe it's the circumstances that you find yourself in. Maybe because things are going so bad, you don't see hope, and then all of a sudden it's that one specific temporary item that you try to blame. And sometimes, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, sometimes this does happen, and if you say it doesn't, I'm going to call you out right now. We even start to blame God. Sometimes we start asking ourselves and we start saying questions like, why is God allowing this in my life? Why do I keep struggling with the same temptation? Why is it so hard if God is so good? Those questions are not nothing new. Those questions are something that every single one of us have asked ourselves in our walk at one point or another. And I'll tell you 100% that if someone who claims that they've walked with God long enough has never asked themselves those questions, they are lying to you. Because the reality is, when life hits us, we start asking ourselves why. If they don't ask themselves why at least once in their lives, they haven't been really put through the ringer like we all have at least once in our lifetime. The beauty of this letter of James is that we get to read and see that a lot of these believers found themselves in certain situations just like we did. When James started off the letter, he started talking about how, hey, I know you guys are pretty much out there. You had to flee. You had to run from your homes. You left your jobs. You left everything because of persecution. The believers that James was writing to were facing intense pressure. They were scattered. Many of them were even struggling financially, and their faith was being tested in real ways. And in the middle of all those trials, something dangerous begins to happen. They start thinking like, well, if we see this, we might attribute it to God doing this to us. Some of these believers were beginning to misunderstand God. Now we can deduct from reading scripture that these believers were beginning to think that if God was allowed the trials, if God is allowing all this to happen, maybe God was responsible for their temptation. They started thinking and putting in their heads, well, if God is letting me go through this, then this is God's fault because he allowed this. Listen, it is really important that we understand that what James is telling us here is really easy for us to run in a completely separate direction. Why do I say that? Because recently I had a coworker of mine come up to me and say, hey, Pastor Adrian, I have a question for you. He goes, I was reading the book of Job not too long ago, and I kind of, when I'm reading everything and I'm seeing what he's going through, his mind was, is it safe to say that God was the one that caused all of these problems for Job? Is it safe to say that it was God's fault that Job went through all of these issues? His whole premise for it was that because God had a conversation with Satan and he said, have you tried my servant Job? That God was the one that caused everything to happen to Job. It is really easy for us to get lost into what we believe rather than what the goodness of God is. What we will be reading here today is not only going to correct these type of thoughts, is not only going to correct us, but it's also going to give us an understanding of what the early church went through. Today, James is going to teach us three truths that we must understand if we're going to navigate any type of trial or temptation in a healthy way. He's going to tell us that the trials that can lead to an eternal reward, he's going to show us that temptation doesn't come just from anything, but it's actually coming from within. And the most important one is that God is never changing. He remains perfectly good. And if we misunderstand any one of these truths, we will begin to develop a distorted view of God. We will begin to start blaming him for everything that goes on rather than what really is happening. So if you have your Bibles, I want to invite you guys to go to James chapter 1. I believe we have some Bibles maybe on the inside of the seats. If there's not some on the inside of the seats, we got some in the back. But we have the verses up on the screen as well. So I'm going to invite you to turn with me to James chapter 1. And we're going to go from verses 12 to 18. And it's going to say this. So it says, "Blessed is the one who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. No one undergoing a trial should say, 'I am being tempted by God,' since God is not tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire. Then, after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. By his own choice, he gave us birth, and by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." This is a powerful word, because up to now, we have seen how James begins to say that we have to consider all these trials to be joy. Not only that, but he's also said that, hey, if you lack any wisdom to go through these trials, ask God. He will give it to you without hesitation. And then he kind of finishes off with last week what we read to that, he says, now, if you see it, you're going to go through it and you're going to find yourself in a situation, you're going to be like, hey, boast about it. Boast about that humble situation. Don't be like these rich people who boast in all of this, but rather boast in his exaltation. And now after he's saying all this, he comes down and he says, hey, now this is where the good part gets, because now you're going to get a reward if you endure all of this. And notice how James begins this section by showing us that those that have this endurance, it will lead us to an eternal reward. James begins this section by saying that blessed is the one who endures trials, because he has stood the test and will receive the crown of life that God has promised them to those who love him. Now that word blessed, is important for us to remember, because it is the same word that Jesus used in the Beatitudes that can be found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 to be specific. When Jesus was telling us, like, blessed is the one that are in poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. It refers to a person who is flourishing under the favor of God. And notice what James says here. He says, blessed is a person, not one that avoids the trials, not one who kind of escapes from them, or not one who does the best to stay away from it. But he said, blessed is the one who endures them. The word that James uses for endurance literally means to remain under pressure. It's the picture of someone who is staying faithful even when life becomes difficult. Someone who is continuously marching forward and trying to keep going even though it's really hard. Let me give you a quick little illustration on how that may look. Every year, thousands of people will sign up for, let's say, the Rock and Roll Marathon that we see here at the Strip, or any other marathon that you can see around, Boston Marathon or something like that, right? People will sign up for these and they want to start running, and they start preparing, and they go all of this. And it's amazing, because when they start the race, they're all excited. They're ready to go. They want to start running, and they're like, I can do this. But by the time they hit the second mile, fatigue starts to set in. They start kind of thinking to themselves, well, maybe this was not a good idea. And if you're like me, by the time you hit the second mile, you're pretty much gassed. You're done. You don't want to keep going. But by the time they get to the 20th mile, that race starts to become not only a physical battle, but a mental battle as well. You start thinking to yourself, well, you know what? I really should not have done it. I should have prepared more. You hit what's called that runner's wall or that runner's block or something like that, right? Where you just kind of like tap out and you're like, okay, I can't keep going. Your mind is telling you you're done. Your body is saying, I'm hurting. Please stop. This is enough. But the medal for completing that race doesn't go to the person who started and then just gives up halfway through or almost there. That medal, that the one that says, hey, you completed this marathon, actually goes to the people who completed. A lot of people do it so they can go in and say, you know what, I've done this and I know I can do this. Hey, if I ran 20 some odd miles, guess what? I can keep on running even more for something else. That medal that goes to the ones that win, if we were to put it into the Christian life or into our perspective, kind of works the same way. We can begin the race, we can start believing and trusting in God, and we can say, you know what, I have a relationship with him now. Now I feel great. Now my life is better. But what's going to happen when you hit those blocks? What's going to happen when life finally hits you and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm a believer. I go to church. I tithe in church. I serve in church. Why is this happening to me? Why am I going through all of this? This is where James tells us that the believer has to stand the test. Why? Because he will receive the crown of life. He's given them an imagery that if we were to study the days of how they lived back then, when he tells them the crown of life, he's given them this picture of a wreath, right? That was given to athletes who were finishing. Rather, if you look at the Olympic athletes back in the day, they would have that wreath saying like, hey, you won, you did this, you completed it, right? Whether it was first, second, or third place, they all received a wreath kind of saying you completed this. And he's giving them that imagery so that, hey, know that when you endure this, when you get past this, you're going to get this victory. You're going to have this wreath that says you did this many, many times. Now, in the ancient Mediterranean context, that crown functioned as a victor's wreath. It was an ornament of honor, or what would be equivalent to a royal crown. And it was amazing because all of this was meant to say, hey, you were victorious. And what James is saying here is like, look, I get it. Things are tough. It hurts. But we have a promise that God has said that he will give us the crown of life if we remain steadfast, if we endure these trials, if we do not give up. In other words, James is reminding these people, he's saying, hey, our endurance, our willingness to maintain and keep going has eternal significance. Because by the time we get to look back and say, you know what, now you get to be with the Father and you look back in your life, you'll be like, dude, I was able to go through all of this. My life really sucked. My upbringing really sucked. But guess what? I was able to endure, not because I did it, but because God did it. One day, every trial, every moment of perseverance, every single act of faithfulness will be worth it. Pastor Adrian Rogers once said that God is more interested in your character than your comfort. And listen, when we read this, you're like, whoa, God, I want to follow you and I want to be comfortable as well. But guess what? What this means is that these trials are not meaningless interruptions in our lives. They're not setbacks. They're not even the end of all things, but rather they are tools that God is going to use us to refine us. And not only refine us, but also refine our faith. So you look at it, well, okay, that's great. How's God going to use this? So I'm going through something now. So how's God going to use this in my favor? What do I got to do afterwards? Well, first we need to reframe how we view these trials. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Instead of telling God, I serve you, I do this for you. Why am I going through this? We should kind of change the way we look at it. And we should start asking God, what are you trying to produce in me? What is this going to teach me so I can better serve you? Listen, church, these trials are often temporary. Everything that we face we will eventually get over it. These trials are often the furnace of where faith is strengthened. It's kind of like putting yourself in the fire, not to be burned, but to come out even stronger. The next thing we need to do is we need to remember that faithfulness matters more than comfort. Yes, it's great. We want to be comfortable. Yes, we want to have everything that we want to. Yes, we want to do things. Even culture will tell us that the goal of our life isn't to be able to be loved by God or to be thought of as someone that is highly favored by God, but rather that we have to have a life that is easy, a life that has conveniency, a life that is worth living, in other words. So they say. The reality is, in our walk with Christ, yes, comfort is great. Comfort's amazing. But we are not called to comfort. We are called to Christ-likeness. We are called to imitate him more in our lives than imitate ours. We aren't called to fame. We aren't called to fortune. We must aim to be more like Christ. And if that means leaving our comforts behind, then we have to be willing to do it. You want a good example of leaving comfort behind? I've shared about it before, what our move was when we came up here. We left everything that we had. But here's the beauty of it, that God uses these difficult times to shape us more into his image. Not into the image that people want to see, not into something that's going to be great, but rather into something that's going to be far greater than any other person can see, and that is his son and his daughters. Now, lastly, we have to make sure that we keep eternity in view. We have to understand that this isn't going to be forever. James reminds us that the one who endures will receive the crown of life. And when we remember eternity, we will see that this suffering is only temporary and is not going to be anything new under the sun. James knows something else. He says that trials don't just test our faith. Some trials expose something a lot deeper inside of us. And that is because when pressure increases, temptation often follows. You start getting all this pressure because of everything that is happening, and then all of a sudden you're trying to do things your own way. All of a sudden you're trying to go back and you're trying to do things the way that you know how. And that leads us to the second point that says that temptation comes from sinful desires. James anticipates a dangerous conclusion of people often reach when they endure trials. He says, no one undergoing a trial should say that I am being tempted by God. Since God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. In other words, James is saying, don't blame God for your temptation. Don't blame God because of the situation that you find yourself in. Don't blame God because all of a sudden 3 years ago you did a mistake and now it's catching up to you. Why? Because God is perfect and holy. He cannot be tempted by evil, and he does not tempt anyone. Much like what I responded to my coworker when he said, like, you know what, God's the one that caused all of this for Job. No, God knew who Job was. God knew that no matter what the enemy did, Job was never going to back down and say that God did this. Job's wife decided to say, you know what, just blame God for all of this and get it over with. His friends are saying, dude, you must have done something really horrible for all of this to happen to you. But Job never once spoke an ill word of God. So now that we see this, we have to think to ourselves, so where does temptation come from? James says it really clear. Each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own desire. That phrase, drawn away and enticed. James uses imagery here that kind of fits in with the people, because now if we use this imagery, he is using fishing and hunting images. He's using the language of fishing and hunting. Picture a fisherman dropping bait into water, and when you cast that line, or if you've ever gone fishing and you cast that line out, put your little bait in there, you get it ready to go, and you throw it out. The fish doesn't go in and say, oh, look, it's a hook. But rather he sees something good. He sees food. And he's over here like, ooh, something's moving. It might be food. Food's going to satisfy me. I'm going to be okay. And it gives him the illusion that something good is there. It gives him the illusion that something's going to satisfy him. But hidden behind that bait is that hook. And the moment that the fish bites into that hook, guess what? It's trapped. Can't go anywhere, he can't do anything. And rather, all of a sudden, now he's getting drawn out from his home. Temptation works the same way. Sin is never advertised by a hook. It's advertised by saying, hey, everything's going to be great. Hey, this is the promise that you want. This is the pleasures that you want. This is all of these things that you want. This is satisfaction. It is fulfillment, and it is everything that you've ever desired. And by the time you start leading yourself into that, guess what? Now you're hooked. Now it's hard to get away from it. Now it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel because you're so far gone. James says that the real problem is not the bait. The real problem is that is the desire that is inside of us. The real problem is never going to be that person in the corner if you've ever walked a strip with the cards of the escorts. It's never going to be what you see on TV. It's going to be what's inside of you. We were all born with a sinful nature. The real problem is that desire that's inside of us that wants it. Jesus says in the Gospel of Mark, he says for us to that sin comes from the human heart. And the beauty of what James is saying is, goes, look, yes, you have a sinful heart, but there's a progress to this. It says first, the desire conceives it. Once it conceives it, sin is born. And once sin is born, guess what? It's going to grow fully if you don't confess it, if you don't repent, if you don't turn back, it's going to grow fully and it's going to produce death. You may think you have it all set in stone because you can get away from all these little things. But if you walk away but don't confess, guess what? Did you really let go of that hook? Did you really get away from it? In other words, sin follows a process. We don't fall into temptation. We don't fall into the sin just because we're human. It begins with desire, and if that desire is nurtured and entertained, kind of like, well, nobody knows about it. I'll be fine. I can still go out and do what I want. Well, I'll be okay. I don't have to say anything. Eventually, it becomes an action. And that action matures into what sin is, and that can lead us to destruction. Steve Lawson once said that sin will always take you further than you intended to go. It'll keep you longer than you intended to stay, and it'll cost you more than you intended to pay. James wants the believers, and he also wants us to understand that temptation is not something God places inside us. It grows from the desire of the human heart. So because it grows from the desire, what should we do with this? How should we go with this truth? Well, first of all, we got to stop blaming external circumstances for our internal sin. And trust me, it's easy to say, oh, well, you know what? My stress caused me to react this way, or I was just really upset, so I lashed out. Well, because of where I live, this is the only way I got to survive, so I had to kind of fall in line with these people too. Or maybe you go on and you say, well, you know what? This happened because so-and-so person got me upset, and now they got what they deserved. It is really easy to say any of these things and blame all these other circumstances. But I will tell you what, blaming all of this is false hope. Because James says that the issue ultimately lies within our hearts. Spiritual maturity begins when we take responsibility for our own desires. We cannot mature if we're not willing to give our heart to Jesus. And we cannot continue to move forward if we're going to say, Jesus, I believe you on Sunday, and then go on Monday and continue our lives the way we want to continue on. Second, we must deal with sin at the desire level. If sin begins with desire, that's when we have to battle the most. That is where we have to start that fight. We have to ask ourselves some honest questions, which is, what desires am I feeding? What am I listening to? What am I watching? What am I reading? What's constantly in front of my face? I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it. Being an officer at the Venetian is no easy task. I get made fun of because when summer comes around, you see all these people going to the beach club and doing this, doing that, and you hear guys, Oh, look, now summer is here. You see everybody now how they're dressed. I'm like, dude, I don't need to. I walk away. The beauty of where I am now in my position is that if I'm seeing everybody coming out of the beach club, I can go to a report writing room and sit in there until everybody's all gone. The question they ask me is, why do you walk away from all of this? It's, oh, you can go see this. Look, I'm single. I can look at whatever I want. I go, great, good for you. I'm not. I'm walking away. We have to ask ourselves, what are we seeing? How are we feeding these desires? What influences are shaping my heart? Ask ourselves these questions and answer them honestly. How are all these going to work in us? And lastly, we have to interrupt that cycle early. Maybe you think you can handle being placed in a position where you look at it, you know what, I'll be fine. And you're standing there. But what happens when you're standing there and all of a sudden you're looking around? Then all of a sudden you're joking around with everybody else. And then next thing you know, one of you guys goes and says, well, don't you go to church? What kind of testimony are we giving to people? We must have to stop those cycles early. James shows us a progression. Desire leads to sin. Sin leads to death. The earlier the cycle is interrupted, the easier it is to stop. But James is not finished yet, because when people struggle with temptation, they sometimes begin to believe something that is dangerous about God. They think that God is holding back the good things. They begin to question whether God is truly good or not because they're facing this situation. They start thinking, well, you know what, God, maybe you don't love me as much because I am dealing with this. When the reality is that God has been giving you an out, but you didn't want to take it. Why? Because, oh, I'm comfortable here. I'm okay. Oh, the pay is nice. Or, you know what, I'll be fine because we're just friends. Nothing's going to happen. We're just friends. But James gives us a strong warning. And he tells us, if you start blaming God, guess what? You're in the wrong, because God is the unchanging source of every good gift. If you believe that because you're dealing with all of this is God's fault, guess what? You're wrong. James tells us, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above. James begins talking about this by saying, James begins this section with a loving but firm warning. He's telling us, don't be deceived. In other words, don't allow yourself to believe the lies of God. If people will come up to you and say, well, maybe you know what? God doesn't want you to be here. That's why you're going through all of this. Maybe God doesn't want you to have this. That's why you're dealing with everything left and right. But James says something that is equally powerful. He tells them that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Everything that we have, everything that is good, that is perfect, it comes from the Creator, the one who created this earth, the one who created the galaxies. James points the people to the heavens. And he tells them, look, the God that created everything is the same God that gives you every good and perfect gift. So if you're going through something, guess what? It is not God that put you in that position. It could be that you made a mistake a while back and now that mistake is catching up to you. It could be that, you know what? You decided to go down this path when this other path was open. It's the consequences to our choices. But look at what James says. James says that God does not change like the shifting shadows. He tells us that God is perfect, that God is good, and he does not change. Now think about the sun throughout the day. As the sun moves, so does our shadows. Right? The sun's going to be right here, our shadow's going to be right behind us. The sun is behind us, now our shadow's in the front. God is not like that. God doesn't shift from one side to the other. His character does not fluctuate, and his goodness does not fade, and his love does not change. Charles Spurgeon once said that God is too good to be unkind and too wise to be mistaken. Even when we don't understand his ways, we can trust his character. And then James gives us the greatest example of God's goodness. In verse 18, he says, by his own choice, he gave us birth by the word of truth. James uses that same birth imagery he used earlier with sin. Earlier, he says, guess what? Hey, your desires will give birth to sin, and sin will give birth to death. But here he's flipping the script and he's saying, God gives you birth to something extremely different. God gives birth to a new life in you. And through the gospel, God transforms your hearts. And through the word, he creates new people. I heard Pastor Vance Pittman once say this, that the gospel is not about getting us into heaven. It is about God transforming us from the inside out. And that transformation begins when we are born again. And we are born again through his word. Not by our own actions, not by what we know, but through his word. And he calls the believers to become first fruits of God's creations. That means we are the beginning of the new creation that God is bringing into this world. You want your family to change, you want something different to happen, guess what? Fall in love with God. Follow his commands, follow his word. You'll start changing, and that impact is going to help with your family. Oh, well, I grew up in a family who doesn't believe in God. So why should I believe in God? Well, look at where you are now. Look back a few years ago, and are you still in the same place? Do you still find yourself with the same characteristics, or has everything changed for you? James ultimately shows us two sources of outcomes: the human desire that produces sin and leads to death, or the goodness of God that produces life. Trials may test us. Temptation may comfort us. But I'll tell you what, when it's all said and done, I want a God that's perfectly good. That even though I go through my own struggles, he still loves me. That even though I find myself deep inside a hole, he is right there still stretching out his arm. We have to realize that a lot of the trials and temptations we go through isn't because God did it. He hasn't changed. He's allowed things to happen in our lives, and he's allowed us to make our mistakes, not so that we can blame him, but so that we can look back and say, you know what, God, when this happened was because I didn't follow you. Or when I dug this hole so deep, it was because I left you. Listen, church, God is not your enemy. He is the giver of every good gift. And through the gospel, he has already begun transforming your life. He has already begun transforming my life. And the same God that began that work will sustain you until you receive the crown of life. The same God that began working in you is the same God that's going to continue to work in you. It is the same God that no matter how far back you take steps, he will still be there for you. And listen, you are not the only one that has doubted God. You're not the only one that has taken a step back from God. And you won't be the last. But I will tell you this. When you start to trust him, when you start to walk with him, his hand's going to be there for you. His answers are always going to be found in this book. So, church, I want to encourage you to trust him, to endure the trials, to endure the temptations, and to walk in the new life that he has given you. Not because everything is going to be great and everything's going to be awesome, but because you're going to be walking and trusting in the one God who doesn't change. Our attitudes will change. Our points of views will change. We may even change ourselves, just who we are. But I'll tell you who won't change. God will never change. And because he will never change, guess what? There isn't a single thing you can do to draw him away from you. You may believe you're far gone, but guess what? The reality is that you're not. He is still standing. He is still waiting. And he is waiting patiently for you to come. So let's trust him. Let's endure these trials. And let's walk in the new life that he has given us. A life that is full of joy, a life that we can see and reflect who he is every day of our lives.